This is BTV World. I am SYED and you are watching Fault Lines. The diplomatic relationship between the United States and China had not been comfortable during the last several years. But at this very moment, both the countries are enjoying the worst part of their diplomatic relationship ever. And this time, China is extremely upset with the visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. Taiwan, that by definition is not an independent country, and even the arch rivals of China cannot officially oppose or do not officially oppose the one China policy. Despite all these facts, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan apparently seems to be a deliberate effort to strain the relationship or to unplease China further. China, taking an stern notice of this diplomatic visit, has started naval exercises in the Strait of Taiwan. Missiles have been fired that have successfully landed on their targets, have hit their targets in the open ocean. Is it all a scare tactic, or actually China is looking to reunite its long-awaited unintegrated part? Are we heading toward another war? And if we do, will the United States play a role again in this conflict? Our team has prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
The Republican Senator Nancy Pelosi paid visit to Taiwan, the first by a Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives in a quarter of a century. It was yet another moment of peril in a world already reeling from the coronavirus pandemic, Russia's war in Ukraine, and mass food shortages. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi accused U.S. politicians of playing with fire, while emphasizing that the U.S. is violating China's sovereignty under the guise of so-called democracy. China has cut off contacts with the U.S. on vital issues including military matters and crucial climate cooperation, and also completed nearly a week of military drills around Taiwan. After the White House summoned China's ambassador Qin Gang to protest the military exercise, White House spokesman John Kirby condemned the decision to end important dialogue with the U.S. as irresponsible. Chinese ambassador in Washington Jin Chuang reiterated that Pelosi's visit to Taiwan has had a severe impact on the political foundations of China-U.S. relations, seriously infringed upon China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and undermined peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. As the world grapples with novel challenges which require cooperation instead of competition, U.S. Republican Senator deepened a rupture between the world's two most powerful countries.
Ladies and gentlemen, to join me, the first guest in this program is Dr. Ejaz Akram. Dr. Ejaz Akram is Professor of Religion and World Politics from Southwestern University of Politics and Law, Chongqing, China. Dr. Ejaz Akram, I welcome you to the program, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Doctor, what is the background of this issue between China and United States due to Taiwan? What is the official status of Taiwan, and what do you believe can be the reason behind the revived interest of United States in Taiwan?
Yes, the background, most people are familiar with it, that in 1949, when the Kuomintang party was beaten by Maoist forces inside China, they took a refuge on this island with the U.S. backing. And so China at that time was recovering from a nasty colonial 100 years. And so at that time, it did not have enough power to seize Taiwan because of the American support to the Kuomintang party, the KMT. So then in a few years' time, of course, China builds up its strength, becomes recognized in the United Nations, and pushes for the one China principle to, up until today, most of the world, I would say, almost without exception, all of the world agrees with the One China principles as a basis in the United Nations, as well as its foundation for relationship with China. China would not accept to talk to any country unless it believed in One China principle. So that is a short background. The U.S., on the other hand, is on the surface does pay lip service and is a part of the One China principle paradigm, but in reality does not, and all of its action prove those.
Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan has further strained the relationship between China and the United States. What exactly do you think United States has tried to achieve out of this recent visit?
some people inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. tend to think that the U.S. has gained something by, trying to push China back on the Taiwan issue. But most analysts, and certainly myself, I'm of the opinion that the United States actually hurt its credibility, its dwindling credibility, furthermore by taking this action. And it's not the first time it took this action. It took this action in 1990s also, remember, 95 and 96, I think. It was Newt Gingrich who went to China back then, and the Chinese did not like it. But the issue is the following, that back then in the mid 90s, China did not nearly had as much military strength as it does now. So obviously today, when Nancy Pelosi, another House Speaker, visits China, of course, China has much more cards to play. And China, in the light of the trade war that took place a couple of years ago, has been almost sort of pushed by the United States to the wall, from where you have no other choice but to retaliate. China itself does not like to take on big powers, does not like confrontation. But when it's really the red lines uncrossed, it used to also respond, but it had less capacity to respond. Today, it has very, very good capacity to respond militarily, in world institutions, in media, and other avenues that are available to the Chinese government. So at a time when China did not even have a few not very good submarines, most of its pilots back in the 90s could not even fly over water, had third generation aircrafts. So it was a very, it was a 4 million man army, but it was a very technologically compromised army. If the United States had taken such an adventure to bully China, it would have held its ground on the mainland, but on Taiwan, maybe not. But today, it has hundreds of strike aircrafts. This exercise, so-called exercise that took place, it's certainly an exercise, but it is not only a warning, but it was actually a rehearsal by China to do what may be needful in the very near future. And for that, China today is very well prepared because of its several programs in the military. The integration of Army, Air Force, Navy was the first one that we saw in a very complex series of strikes and exercises. The flying of the missiles, of not the strikes on the ground, but flying missiles over Taiwan and so forth, and landing them on their targets inside the water. So it actually displayed an amazing level of integration in these three armed forces, which wasn't there before in the Chinese case, and it has come about. Even aircraft carrier had something to do with this current exercise. China had moved a lot of its military logistics supply lines into the province of Fujian, which is closest to the Taiwanese coast. And the areas around the city of Xiamen are where the supplies and reinforcement have been planned and taking effect. And I think, and the eastern side is littered with such backup mechanism should China get into war with Taiwan, which in my point of view, it seems somehow unfortunately imminent, because my own position is that the unification should take place amongst the two brother countries, and it's this type of reunification with the mainland should be peaceful and with dignity and honorable for both parties. But the United States is the monkey's wrench. They do not want that, as they do not want that in Korea. They do not want that in Kashmir. They benefit from that, centuries-old backward thinking of divide and rule. So that's where I would stand on this issue.
Right. I agree with you. But Dr. Ijaz Akram, do you mean that these are all scare tactics, or you see this to have a potential of becoming an all-out war between the two sides?
Yes. As far as your first question is concerned, that whether it was a rehearsal or whether it was just a scare tactic to send a signal to the Taiwanese. The signals have been sent before also. And certainly this time around, of course, the signal was sent. But they look at the diplomatic language that the Chinese government used prior to the landing of Nancy Pelosi in Taipei. That type of language is very uncharacteristic of China, but they used it nonetheless because they felt that a red line is being crossed. Now, as far as the light exercises are concerned, they were not only sending a threat or a signal or a warning sign to Taipei. That was actually also a rehearsal of its forces with live fire drills that should China have to engage in such a thing, then what would be the military modalities of doing so? And I think that they must have learned something during during this exercise.
Dr. Ijaz, if war is imminent between the two sides, or if unfortunately it happens to break out between these two sides, how would United States respond? Would United States just stand as a bystander in this entire process?
The United States will, in my opinion, not militarily engage directly with a direct confrontation with China because it knows the consequences of doing so. And it doesn't have a history of taking on such big and organized nations who can outsupply the United States in that region. So United States couldn't even defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan, a ragtag army. I mean, so to defeat China would be a very difficult proposition for the U.S. However, China, I think, that has the capacity to take Taiwan, but China does want to take it peacefully and does want to take it with honor and dignity for the Taipei people, for the Taiwanese people, because it realizes that if it offends the Taiwanese public, the civil society of Taiwan, then even if it gains hold of the island, it will have resistance from people. And it does not want resistance from the people of Taiwan. It just realizes that there is a handful of people in KMT that are towing the American line. And there's so many countries that are like that, where a handful of people have come and taken control of governments. And so, and China hopes that with due course of time, they will be able to subvert that. And if not, through diplomatic means, obviously this resolution, if it had to go to be resolved with diplomatic means, it would have been resolved long time ago. But obviously that didn't happen. So China does realize that it will have to use a combination of kinetic and non-kinetic means to gain its foothold in Taiwan. And I think it has a history of keeping Hong Kong also mostly the way it is, minus the CIA mischief, which tries to instigate color revolutions in Hong Kong. They will continue to do that in Taiwan as well because they will still have some assets left there after, if and when they leave the Americans. But until that happens, I think that the United States will keep on trying to bank on try to convince the Taipei government to take on the Chinese because they do want a limited war or a slightly bigger war in China's eastern neighborhood, so they can engage in China in its western neighborhood using India and the AUKUS and the Quad and what have you. So I think that the Chinese, the U.S. expectation from I don't think any thing bigger than what the type of help they have offered in Ukraine. There were so many guarantees to Ukraine also, but the Ukrainian people signed on. The soft coup was made, and the government was convinced that you need to be you need to be an instrument of extension of NATO to the east, without realizing the consequences, what would happen, how Putin would react. And now, when a certain percentage of territory has been taken inside Ukraine, the Ukrainian people are quite dismayed with not only just the United States, but the West and NATO and EU. On the other hand, it's too little, too late, and we have lost a lot of territory inside Ukraine. So, and this area is still, Europe is still right next to Ukraine, where NATO is very strong, but this area is very, very far away. So you have Philippines that has the capacity to defect against the Americans or delay their supplies or logistical support. You have Okinawa base in Japan. That also is not, Americans are not very popular in that region. So whatever type of support they may have in these bases that are around them, and there's literally, there's dozens of them, it's still, United States is far away from home. And so if the things becomes hot, and the war becomes really, really active between not just Taiwan and China, but China starts taking out targets that are maybe outside of this conflict zone. That's when the United States will start faltering, because China has the capacity to supply and produce and reproduce at a very short notice. And I think that the Americans will suffer shortage of supplies and ammunition. There's already talk about this in the context of Ukrainian war, but I think this may be a big challenge for the United States in a Taiwan war if one takes place.
Dr. Ijaz, do you agree that there has been a lack of consistency, a lack of coherence, and a lack of clarity in United States diplomatic language that they have adopted, or the strategy that they have adopted toward the issue of Taiwan? And if so, what do you believe can be the reasons of this inconsistency?
Look, like I said earlier, the U.S. has lost its credibility because of the way it has done its decision-making over the last couple of decades. It thought that it was the only unipolar power, and now it could get away with whatever it wants. But that moment was rather short-lived. So very soon we realized that the United States has taken a lot of reckless action, started these wars of aggression all around the world to no avail other than impoverishing their own people. But if you look at how decision-making inside the Beltway takes place in Washington, D.C., you have certain clusters of power. So I don't think that Nancy Pelosi and Pentagon and Joe Biden were not on the same page. I don't believe that. I think that was just the positioning, because they realized that when the responses come, when the reaction comes to this, then they could shift the blames between different power centers. But I think they're all on board. It's because in all three cases, the forces that wield influence in American political system, the paymasters, they are the same. So therefore, I would say that the U.S. has certainly lost credibility because of that. The lobbies that pressurize the political system of America, they don't have to deal with the aftermath of bad decisions. That rests on the shoulder of the politicians, on the shoulder of the military, and on the shoulder of the departments that govern policy. And so, and that's why I think that the United States actually has had nothing to gain other than disrepute and other than cementing its impression as an aggressor. So they had nothing to gain. So many Americans have come out and said that. If you look at the alternative analysis that are coming out of the U.S. press right now, especially in the social media, it's replete with questioning the logic of why this was done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ijaz Akram, for being guest in our program.
Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with the second segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen, the recent problem that we saw that made all of us cry was the issue between Israel and Palestine. Again, Israel unleashed its brutal use of naked aggression and targeted the people of Gaza. This time, the conflict doesn't arise out of any rockets fired from the side of Hamas. But what Israel declared it to be was a preemptive strike. A preemptive strike that has taken the life of many innocent children. Why all of this is happening over and over? What international world is doing about it? And why all of this cannot be stopped? Why Israel goes for the option of use of violence every time, and what exactly Israel wants to accomplish out of it? All of this in this segment of program. But first, watch the package prepared by Team Faultlines before I bring my first guest to this part of my program.
The unabated bloodshed in the occupied Palestine continues as Israel escalates its imperial ambitions. Exhibiting its imperial tyranny, Israeli forces carried out fresh attacks on Gaza. Israeli forces launched what they described as preemptive raids on Gaza after arresting a senior member of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The bloody onslaught on Gaza killed at least 45 Palestinians, including 16 children. Hundreds of people in the territory were injured, according to Gaza's health ministry. The Egyptian brokered ceasefire after 3 days of heavy Israeli bombardment provided some relief, but both sides have reserved the right to respond if the ceasefire is breached. The 3-day assault was the worst Israeli attack on Gaza since an 11-day war last year that killed at least 260 people in Gaza. Large portions of besieged Palestinian enclave were demolished by Israeli forces in the 2021 attack, and efforts to rebuild were still underway when the latest attacks were launched by the Israeli forces. The UN Security Council has held an emergency meeting to discuss the situation in Gaza. UN Middle East envoy warned that the ceasefire is fragile and any resumption of hostilities will only have devastating consequences for Palestinians and make any political progress on key issues elusive.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. To join me on the Skype is Dr. Khalid Kadumi. Dr. Khalid Kadumi is official spokesman of Hamas and joining me from Skype, through the Skype. I'm not going to disclose the location of him. Dr. Khalid Kadumi, welcome to the program.
So, alaikum assalam. Thank you for having me with you.
Dr. Khalid, what has happened in Palestine once again? What Israeli forces have done this time, they don't even apparently have a fake reason for it.
Thank you once again, Sayyid SHABAHAT, for having me at your program. Actually, to make it very clear to your audience, we have been under oppression for the last 74 years since the inception of the Israeli entity as an occupier to our land. And having said that, we need to highlight that the biggest crime against us is to snatch our freedom, is not to allow us to live as any free nation in the world. So we are continuously under the Israeli aggression and oppressions. And having also come back to your question, Israel, unfortunately, they were always using this language of incitement and pretext, and that the few rockets has been launched from this side, or maybe a stone has been thrown against an Israeli tank, and in retaliation of that stone, we have a land scorching attack from the Israeli troops in retaliation to that stone. What has happened on Friday, 5th of August in Gaza, simply that we were running a normal day and there were a new threatening from Israel, according to them, that there is an expected threat from our brothers in Jihad Islami, which is baseless, which is the normal routine, because they are trying to do incursion in Al-Aqsa Mosque. They are attacking on our people in Nablus and Jenin. They have killed tens of the last 24 hours, Brother Shabahat. We are having 20 points where we are having a direct confrontation with the Israeli forces in West Bank, not in Gaza, from civilian sides against this Israeli well-equipped army that have killed all our children and other youngsters. Look at it in other angle. Now, when they are saying that that this is an incitement, this and that, because I don't understand really such language. Look at the end result. We have Ala Qaddoum, 5 years daughter, a martyr. We have more than 54 martyrs among youngsters, amongst them 15 kids below 14 years old. Do you think that really this qualify any reason to go for killing such innocent human being? I think that the narrative of Israeli forces is baseless. It's no more accepted even to the international community. It was a routine day, and Israel simply, they want to encash on our blood their own internal pitfalls of election needs and political weakness. So unfortunately, as many scholars, including some Israeli scholars, they are saying that the popularity of Labid, the candidate elect for the prime ministership, has been increased more than 64% among the Israeli society after this attack and after this massacre against Gaza. This was the exact reason which I can tell you that behind this attack and aggression of Israel against our innocent civilian people in Gaza.
Dr. Khalid, you just said, and let me rephrase, that Hamas cannot even be lamely blamed for it this time. They had not provided any justification to Israeli forces to unleash their naked use of aggression.
Not even a single international report can go with any narrative of Israel, including the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, Amnesty International, European governments, and many setups internationally, including Palestinian, Arab, and Islamic, who has condemned this attack and used the word of no reason, no rationality behind it. Though, as I told you before, that for us, we are in a continuous state of defense since the last 74 years of occupation, because occupation by itself is a crime. And we, Palestinians, have been granted the right to defend ourselves by international law through any means. Nevertheless, this time was no reason can be proved by Israeli government except that they want to have more Palestinian blood in order to encash it in their own political process.
Dr. Khalid, are there any saner voices in Israel? Any voices that do not support the use of brute force every time? Are there people who actually love peace and do not like the blood of Palestinians to be shed like animals every time?
See, this is a very good question, because many of our friends, they are trying always to raise that humanity voices among the enemy bloc and other things. So far, we have seen many Jews in America even thronged into the streets, in New York in millions, against the Israeli atrocities against our people in Palestine. We have seen Naturi Karta, we have seen those Jews who have been discriminated and have been even tortured by Israeli government because simply they are against the war. We have seen intellectuals, the famous Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, who has been attacked by many Israeli commentators, and at the end of the day, he had to strip his nationality and withdraw it. We have seen generals, even retired generals, who are talking so-called rational debate against the Israeli atrocities against our innocent people. But at the end of the day, they have no weight in the decision-making in the Israeli arena. The last government in Israel was so-called the alliance government, which has gathered the rightists, the leftists, the secular, the religious themes in the Israeli society. They were all talking about more confiscation of the lands of the Palestinians, building more settlements. In the last 1 year, more than 400 settlements has been built, and by the order of the so-called coalition government inside Israel, which has collapsed because of the security pockets and because of the failing of their own political programs. And then we have more incursions to the holy shrines. Top of them is Al-Aqsa Mosque. Al-Aqsa Mosque, which has been announced or declared by UNESCO itself as a place for worshipping of Muslims. It has been raided by Israeli forces. It has been raided by extremist Jewish settlers. And then the UNESCO raised a big question. This is a place for worshipping for Muslims. I mean, it's nothing relevant to the religious war. We have no problem as Muslims with Christians or with Jews. Our problem that this is as a church is for Christian and a synagogue is for Jews, there is a mosque for Muslim. So what is the business of another non-Muslim to go into that place and try to perform their own religious, non-Muslim religious rituals on that place? All this has been practiced by many political figures. Rather, many incursions, brother, have been to the Al-Aqsa Mosque headed by members of the parliaments. They are representative of the society. They go over there. What we have witnessed in short, that the Israeli society are going day by day to the right, and the voices of so-called extreme religious fanatic Jewish group is taking its own place inside the government. They started in the past as those groups which are even non-permitted groups inside the Israeli society, and they grow up step by step. And unfortunately, today they are even mounting to the bloc that can also compete for the premiership. They also passed a lot of resolutions against even the so-called principles of democracy inside the so-called Israeli entity. Let me finish on that by saying that the Israeli government and succeeding Israeli governments and the decision makers in Israel, they think out of security priority, not out of so-called humanity. Hence, even if at all there is some so-called rational voices, they have no place in this criminal, rightist, Zionist regime.
Dr. Khalid, I have learned through many international reports that Egypt has played a pivotal role in taking Israel's, stopping Israel from this use of force. Maybe they arbitrated a deal between Hamas and Israel. Tell us more about it, sir.
Well, Egypt has two identities that qualify them to be the big brother to us in Palestine. One is geography. We are neighbors. The second thing that Egyptian people, they have participated even in our struggle since the beginning of this tragedy inside Palestine. On the other hand, even Egypt, because they are involved with some peace process with Israel since 1978 in Camp David I, though unfortunately or fortunately, it has no fruit really benefited the Egyptian people. And today, Egyptian people, they do not even, the last thing they think about it is to have good relation or normal relation with Israel. According to the Israeli ambassador in Cairo, she was saying that there is nothing called normalization with the Egyptian people. I don't go freely in the bazaar. I don't move on my own. No one in Egypt like us. So after how many years? Since 1978. The so-called mediation of Egyptian brothers for ceasefire, always they interfere because of the main two issues I have mentioned to you. They are very dear and near to us, and they are also geographically our neighbors. In the last Israeli offensive, the Egyptian also shifted or conveyed, I would say, the demands of the resistance and our people to facilitate the good behavior with our prisoners inside behind the Israeli bars, and also to set free some of our prisoners from there. And the Egyptian, they have promised. Unfortunately, brother, The Israeli, they have signed rather many of the treaties with us directly and indirectly. With us, I mean the Palestinian, not with Hamas. Okay, since many years. But at the end of the day, they have never respected their saying. They have never respected their promises. And at the end of the day, this is the difficult reality.
Dr. Khalid, let me come back to my question. I'm afraid we have lost the line of argument that I was essentially looking for. My question is, has Egypt brokered a deal this time?
Yeah, I have told you. They have conveyed the conditions of Palestinian to the Israeli side. That is to ease and facilitate the life of our prisoners behind the bar and behind the Israeli bars, and also to set free some of our prisoners over there. But still, till moment, we have only listened here for promises, but Israel did not fulfill any of those promises till moment.
And Dr. Khalid, have the bombing stopped as of now when we speak?
Yeah, I told you that from our side, we have respected the Egyptian desire to stop in order to take time to fulfill the promises which has been conveyed to them by Israelis. This is the thing. So we respected our words to the Egyptian, but unfortunately, stopping of the bombardment, which has been started already without any incitement by the Israeli side, is not the end of the game. Look what they have continued to do in West Bank. They have killed 3 of our innocent youngsters. They have injured more than 40 civilians in 24 hours. It's a total war. It's not less than what they have done to Gaza even. This is the scenario. It's now no one to blame but the Israeli mentality, the Israeli way of behaving to the international community. Israeli, even in United Nations, their representative, they move even in front of the camera to rip the resolutions of the United Nations against it, and they walk out. They do respect only the power and the force. Unfortunately, the international community has to understand that there are heaps of resolutions against this entity since 1967 till today, and none of them has been implemented, and rather none of them has its own teeth to be enforced against Israel. So we are left to our own destiny, to our own way of defending ourselves and looking for a prosperous and independent free life as any other free nation in the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khalid Kadumi, for being guest in our program.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, to talk more about this issue, I am now joined by another international expert. His name is Mark Muhannad Ayash. He is professor of sociology at Mount Royal University of Canada, frequently writes for Al Jazeera, and is also an independent author. Mark Ayash, I welcome you to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. A pleasure to be back.
Mark, as we were discussing with the guests who came before you, again, this act of violence by Israel apparently doesn't even have a fake reason. What would you say about it?
Well, there's a whole host of immediate causes to why this latest eruption or latest attack on Gaza has taken place. But ultimately, Israel has besieged Gaza for 15 years or a little bit more than that even. And it regularly unleashes its full military onslaught on the Gazan population in order to eradicate Palestinian resistance. So as you say, they always give fake reasons for why they had to do this or that operation. But ultimately, Israel is engaged in a violent siege of Gaza throughout this whole period. And every once in a while, we'll see the sort of most visible version of that violence in these full military onslaughts. But the reasons for why that happens is because Israel is always trying to assert its dominance over Palestinians in order to eradicate Palestinian resistance. That's the real reason why Israel does any of this.
Mark, don't you think there is a clear disconnect between the political administration of the West Bank and Hamas, and it is becoming primarily a reason why Palestinians' political leadership is getting more isolated?
So on the political level, yes, it has. It has weakened Palestinian resistance movement as a whole. And Palestinians on the ground in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, Palestinians in the diaspora, they see this. And that's why they keep calling for a sort of the unification on that political level. But you know, on the ground, people are still united. We saw this last year in what Palestinians called the Unity Intifada, which is a way for Palestinians on the street to say, you know, we are united. We are not as fragmented as people think that we are. But yes, to a certain degree, by design, Israel and its allies have managed to fragment the Palestinian leadership. And of course, the reasoning for that is simple. A fragmented leadership is easier to dominate. So unfortunately, it has become, you know, that strategy has worked for Israel, and it has weakened Palestinians on that sort of a higher political level. But on the street level, Palestinians are still united, and they do work with each other, you know, despite the factional differences. So, you know, we do want to see, though, more work on unification on all levels in Palestinian politics. That's for certain.
All right, Mark, what do you think Israel wants to accomplish with the use of brute force? Because we haven't seen the use of force accomplishing any major objectives anywhere in the world.
I mean, this is a great question. And in my view, Israel cannot achieve what it actually wants to achieve through violence. It thinks it can, but it really can't. And so let me try to sort of get back again to a little bit more of the foundational structures as opposed to immediate causes. Because, you know, people will mention, well, the Israeli elections are coming up, and that's why they want it to be tough and, you know, show that they are tough and could lead Israel, et cetera, et cetera. You know, so there are, and I don't deny that we should be talking about these immediate causes, but there are more foundational issues here at play. Israel was founded in violence. There is no Israel without the expulsion of Palestinians from their homelands in 1948. In fact, this process began prior to 1948. But 1948 was the event in which Israel became what it is through violence, through the expulsion of Palestinians. That violence is not contained within that historical era. That violence continues to this day. It still hasn't abated. It still hasn't stopped. So every time we see Israeli violence, it has to be understood, and it is best understood as a continuation of that violence that started in 1948. Again, it started a little bit before that, but let's even just start it in 1948. So that all Israeli violence is ultimately a violence of expulsion. It tries to expel Palestinians from their lands. And Israel sees this violence as necessary for its existence because it can only exist through violence. It can only exist through the violence of expulsion. But the issue here is that they've been trying this violence of expulsion, and of course, it has achieved. It has expelled Palestinians. That's a fact. It has expelled Palestinians from their homelands. So for Israelis, from an Israeli perspective, they can say, well, violence has worked for us. It has expelled Palestinians and created Israel. But despite those, you know, successes as they see it, Palestinians still remain. There's still Palestinians all over Palestine. And the Palestinians who have been expelled and have lived their entire lives now in refugee camps, whether you're talking about in Lebanon, in Jordan, exiles in Canada, in the United States, wherever, in Chile, wherever Palestinians are, they've not forgotten that Palestine is their homeland. So no, that violence hasn't worked because it hasn't stopped our resistance. We still are insisting on our right to return to the lands from which we were expelled. So in that sense, that violence of expulsion is not working and cannot work because we've been fighting back and resisting for 100 years. And guess what? We're going to go for at least 100 more years if that's what's needed. I hope it doesn't need to be that long. But if that's what's needed, we'll do that. And we'll go longer than that if need be. So Palestinians will never give up their claim to the land. They'll never give up their sovereign claim to the land as a people who belong to Palestine. And in that sense, all of these Israeli violences, as brutal as they are and as destructive as they are, that's all they're ever going to be is brutal and destructive violences that are not going to actually achieve Israel's goal, which is the elimination and eradication of the Palestinian claim to that land.
That's right, Mark, but the people, when we talk about the people of Gaza, they are blockaded from all the sides. They're besieged from all the corners. They cannot go anywhere out, even if they wish to. What would Israelis accomplish out of bombing the people of Gaza if they cannot go out anywhere?
Yes, no, actually, so that's a really important point. And as Palestinian scholars have pointed out, what is happening in Gaza is actually not that different from what's happening in the West Bank. It's just happening on a larger scale. So in the West Bank, you have all sorts of Palestinian communities that are besieged. They can't leave their teeny tiny spaces in which they can move freely and go visit Al-Aqsa Mosque or go visit their families in Jerusalem. So you actually have these little blockades, if you will, and sieges of Palestinian communities all over the West Bank. In Gaza, it's just happening on a larger scale. And you do have, as you rightly point out there, that the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are besieged, are blocked, are not able to move outside of that area. You know, we have all sorts of stories of kids having to go get surgeries at hospitals in Jerusalem without their parents, kids as young as 5 and 6 years old. So their ability to move is highly restricted. But that's part and parcel of Israeli plans for all Palestinians. Restrict them, make them unable to move beyond very small pieces of land, make life unlivable for them so that eventually they just leave. Early architects of the besiegement of Gaza did actually say this out loud, that, hey, life will be so bad there that they'll just go somewhere else. They'll move to London, they'll move to Jordan, and they'll leave their lands. And so it shows you that it's always about annexation and expulsion for Israel. So it's not that dissimilar. Look, there are, of course, differences in how Palestinians will experience this on the ground in different locations, but ultimately they all follow the same kind of logic, which is, contain Palestinians to small pieces of land where they can be easily dominated and controlled by the Israeli forces.
Mark, would you agree with me if I say that Palestinians are today diplomatically more isolated because of tremendous efforts by United States of America that has successfully isolated the people of Palestine from the support of the Arab nations?
Unfortunately, yes, that is happening. And again, though, I differentiate here between what's happening on the sort of political level and what's happening on the streets. On the streets, I still think there's a lot of support for Palestinians from Arab countries, Muslim countries, African countries, even in Europe. There's still lots of support for Palestinians on the grassroots level, people to people. Politically, though, we are isolated. Palestinians are isolated, absolutely. And there are some serious failures here of Palestinian leaderships. Yes, the odds are against us, but we could do better on the level of leadership to improve our diplomatic position, which is, as you rightly point out, it's quite weak at this point. But Palestinians have a lot of appeal to people. Because people power all over the world can relate to the Palestinians, can understand that the Palestinians are being oppressed and dominated, and that they have justice on their side. People see that, and I don't think that part has weakened. But unfortunately, diplomatically speaking, Palestine has a lot of work to do to fix their position in the diplomatic arena. I would agree with that.
Thank you very much, Mark, for being guest in my program again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, the state of Israel has not given up the use of force and violence. Violence that has not been able to accomplish any objectives even in the past. Violence that is not solution to any of the international disputes. Violence, something that will keep reminding the community of the world of their utmost responsibilities toward the people of Palestine. We'll join you tomorrow again with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.